What kind of wife carries this in her purse for a business trip? You thought I would not notice? Mark whispered to himself, holding up the small bottle of lubricant he had just pulled from the side pocket of Lydia's handbag. His hands trembled. His chest pounded. For a moment the room went silent, except for the sound of his own breathing. Viewers, let me ask you something right now. If you were in Mark's shoes, and you found this hidden in your partner's bag before they left for a business trip, would you confront them immediately? Or would you play along, pretending not to know while quietly planning your next move? Think carefully, because what Mark decided to do would change both of their lives forever. He stood in their neatly arranged bedroom in downtown Chicago, surrounded by the half-packed suitcase lying open on the bed. Lydia, his wife of 8 years, was in the bathroom singing softly as she applied her makeup, preparing for the 3-day conference she claimed she couldn't miss. Mark stared at the bottle again. His first instinct was denial. Maybe it wasn't what it looked like. Maybe she packed it by mistake. But then, why would a woman need this for a professional trip? His gut twisted, memories flashing through his mind, the late nights at the office, the sudden change in her wardrobe, the coldness in her kisses lately. It all began to fit together like pieces of a cruel puzzle. He placed the bottle back, but not before an idea, dark, dangerous, but strangely satisfying, crept into his mind. He opened the drawer where he kept his self-defense items and pulled out a small canister of pepper spray. His lips pressed into a tight line as he carefully swapped the bottles, placing the pepper spray in her purse where the lubricant had been. From the bathroom, Lydia called out, "Honey, can you zip up the suitcase for me? I don't want to be late." "Of course," Mark replied, his voice calm, controlled, almost too calm. He zipped it shut, planted a soft kiss on her forehead when she stepped out, and smiled as though nothing was wrong. To Lydia, he was still the loving husband. But inside, he was boiling with suspicion, rage, and a thirst for the truth. As they drove to the airport, Mark kept his composure. He even carried her luggage like the dutiful partner he had always been. Lydia kissed him goodbye, promising to call as soon as she landed. Her perfume lingered in the air as she disappeared into the terminal. Mark watched her walk away, but instead of sorrow, a strange fire burned inside him. He wasn't going to confront her yet. No, confrontation would only give her the chance to lie. What he needed now was evidence, proof that would strip her mask away once and for all. This was only the beginning. Mark drove back home from the airport with his mind on fire. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, and though his face appeared calm to strangers on the street, inside, he was at war with himself. Am I imagining things? Could I be wrong about her? He thought. But then he remembered the bottle. No, he wasn't wrong. Something about Lydia's trip didn't add up, and he was going to get to the bottom of it, quietly. That night, after pouring himself a glass of bourbon, Mark sat at the dining table with his laptop. He knew Lydia's work email and even her passwords. She had given them to him years ago when they were still madly in love, back when trust came easily. Slowly, carefully, he logged in. At first, the inbox looked normal. Corporate memos, updates, boring attachments. But then, his eyes caught on a string of private messages with a subject line titled, "Conference Details." His heart dropped. The sender wasn't the event organizer. It was her boss, Richard Thornton. Richard. The name alone made Mark's teeth grind. He was everything Lydia admired. Tall, confident, a silver-tongued executive with money and influence. Lydia had spoken of him often, always too casually, brushing off Mark's suspicion whenever he questioned why Richard's name came up so frequently. Mark clicked the first message. His pulse quickened as the words unfolded. "Can't wait to finally have you all to myself for a few days. No office walls, no interruptions, just us. Don't forget to bring what we talked about." Mark's stomach turned. What we talked about? He knew exactly what that meant. The lubricant wasn't a mistake. It was a tool for their secret intimacy. He kept reading, each message more poisonous than the last. I've booked us the best suite. 3 nights. Private dinners. You're mine, Lydia. His hand trembled, but he forced himself to keep scrolling. Screenshots, receipts, travel itineraries. The entire affair lay bare before him, hidden in plain sight. For a moment, Mark thought of confronting her right away, but then, a colder, sharper part of him whispered, "No, don't waste this. She thinks you're blind. Let her dig her own grave. Play the perfect husband, then strike when she least expects it." But he couldn't do this alone. He needed evidence that would stand. That's when the idea of hiring someone came to him, not just anyone, a private investigator. The next morning, Mark made a discreet call to an old college friend, Victor, who now ran a private security firm. "Vic, I need someone who's invisible, someone who can track a person without being noticed. No mistakes," Mark said, his tone calm but deadly serious. Victor hesitated. "This sounds personal, Mark." "It is. And I want every photo, every recording, every single proof you can get me," Mark replied. By evening, the investigator was already on Lydia's trail, following her from the airport to her so-called conference. What Mark received that night was the first piece of devastating proof. Lydia and Richard laughing arm in arm, checking into a luxury hotel that had nothing to do with business. Mark stared at the picture for a long time, his jaw set like stone. His suspicions weren't just true, they were worse than he imagined. And the pepper spray in her purse? That was only the first domino in the chain of destruction he was about to set off. The photos Victor sent replayed in Mark's mind like a cruel film. Lydia, glowing with laughter, Richard's hand brushing her waist as though she belonged to him. They looked like a couple who had nothing to hide, 2 people indulging in a secret they thought was untouchable. But Mark knew something they didn't. Inside Lydia's purse wasn't what they thought it was. The canister she'd packed so confidently, the one she intended for passion, was about to betray her in the most painful way. That night, as Mark sat in his dark living room, he pictured the moment unfolding in their hotel suite. Lydia, certain she had outsmarted him. Richard, smug in his authority and charm, neither of them realizing that their private paradise was about to turn into a nightmare. Hours later, Mark's phone buzzed. It was Victor again. "You're not going to believe this." His voice crackled with barely contained amusement. "I tailed them to the suite. Everything was smooth at first, but then it all went wrong. Horribly wrong." Mark leaned forward, his chest tightening. "Tell me." Victor chuckled. "I don't know what she had in her purse, but whatever it wasn't what they expected. The moment they got comfortable, there was screaming. Real screaming. He was rolling on the floor, clutching himself. She was shrieking, her eyes burning, begging for help. Hotel staff rushed in. I swear it was chaos. They had to call an ambulance. Both of them ended up in the ER. For the first time in weeks, Mark smiled, a small, grim smile that never reached his eyes. "Good," he said softly. The news spread quickly in whispers among the hotel staff. 2 respected professionals, both married, rushed out of a luxury suite in humiliating pain. It didn't take long for rumors to ignite. Chicago was a city that thrived on gossip, and in their corporate circle, nothing stayed quiet for long. Back at home, Mark played the role of the loving husband. He cooked dinner, kept the house in order, even sent Lydia text messages asking how the conference was going. Her replies were vague, short, filled with excuses about being tired and busy with work. She didn't dare tell him the truth, that she was recovering from a hospital visit caused by something she couldn't explain. But Mark wasn't satisfied. This was only the first strike, a wound to their pride, a reminder that betrayal had consequences. He wanted her world to crumble piece by piece until she had nothing left to cling to. Late one night, as he poured himself another drink, Mark whispered to the empty room, "This was just the beginning, Lydia. You broke me when you chose him. Now I'll break you, slowly, carefully, and in ways you'll never see coming." The pepper spray incident was just the opening move in a game of revenge Lydia didn't even know she was playing. And Mark had no plans of losing. The hospital humiliation had rattled Lydia, but Mark knew her well enough to predict what came next. Denial. She would cover her tracks, paste on a professional smile, and pretend nothing happened. People like her didn't crumble after one stumble. They doubled down, and that was exactly why he couldn't stop now. The pepper spray had been a warning shot. What came next would be the bullet. Mark poured his energy into gathering proof, not just scraps of gossip or rumors, but hard, undeniable evidence that could tear through the carefully constructed image Lydia and Richard had built for themselves. He reached out to Victor again. "I want it all," Mark said firmly. "Photos, recordings, receipts. Every hotel check-in, every dinner date, every text message. I don't want shadows. I want facts. Enough to ruin them both if I dropped it on a desk tomorrow." Victor exhaled. "You're asking for a complete takedown?" "Yes," Mark replied, his voice cold. "This isn't just about catching her. It's about making sure she never rises again." Over the next few weeks, Mark received file after file. Photos of Lydia and Richard holding hands in parking garages, surveillance of them sneaking into hotels during work hours, copies of credit card statements showing dinner bills charged to Richard's company card, paid during hours that were supposed to be meetings. But what gutted Mark most were the text messages. Victor had intercepted enough to reveal the affair in its rawest form, messages dripping with intimacy, confessions of love, promises of a future together. One message from Lydia read, "I wish I could leave him already. You make me feel alive, Richard. He doesn't even see me anymore." Mark read that line over and over, feeling the words slice into him like glass. He thought of the nights he'd stayed up waiting for her, the anniversaries he'd tried to make special, the sacrifices he'd made for their marriage. And in return, she had called him invisible. Yet, instead of rage, Mark felt clarity. This wasn't about saving the marriage anymore. It was about saving himself, reclaiming the pride she had stolen. By the end of the month, he had a thick folder of evidence, neatly organized and ready to detonate. But Mark was no fool. He knew timing was everything. A bomb dropped too early only gave the target a chance to recover. So he waited, patient as a predator. At home, he played the doting husband, asking Lydia about her day, cooking her favorite meals, smiling as though nothing was wrong. He even surprised her with flowers one evening, watching her eyes light up with guilt she couldn't confess. All the while, Mark's mind was already in the future. The boardroom where her career would end, the family dinner where her lies would unravel, the courtroom where he would walk away free while she drowned in shame. Every secret has an expiration date, and Lydia's was about to spoil in the most public way imaginable. Mark had the evidence, photos, screenshots, hotel receipts, love notes tucked away in encrypted emails. Proof strong enough to shatter Lydia's world in an instant. But revenge wasn't just about having the truth. It was about how and when the truth was revealed. He didn't want to confront her in the kitchen shouting over a dinner plate. That would be too small, too private. No, Lydia's betrayal had been loud in its secrecy. The payback had to be louder, undeniable, impossible to spin. One evening, while Lydia was getting ready for another late work dinner, Mark sat at the edge of their bed, scrolling through the folder of evidence on his phone. He looked up at her reflection in the mirror. She was wearing a silk blouse, her makeup perfect, her perfume thick in the air. She smiled faintly at him, though her eyes looked distracted. "Wish me luck," she said, adjusting her earrings. "Always," Mark replied, his voice calm, measured. Inside, he was already 10 steps ahead. That night after she left, Mark drafted an anonymous email. No names, no fingerprints, just attachments, photos of Lydia and Richard, their messages, hotel bills. He scheduled the email to be sent to 3 inboxes simultaneously: the Human Resources Department at Lydia's company, the Executive Board, and, most importantly, Richard's wife, Susan, But he wasn't going to hit send just yet. He needed the right occasion, the perfect stage. And then, as if fate itself was watching, the opportunity arrived. Lydia's company was hosting a quarterly dinner gala. A room full of colleagues, senior executives, board members, and their families. A night designed to celebrate loyalty, professionalism, and team spirit. The irony was almost poetic. Mark secured his invitation easily. Lydia insisted he attend as her husband. "It'll be nice to show you off," she said, kissing his cheek. He smiled back, hiding the storm brewing beneath. In the days leading up to the gala, Mark prepared carefully. He rehearsed his expressions in the mirror, smiling, laughing, nodding at conversations. He would play the perfect gentleman, the supportive spouse. No one would suspect he had a grenade tucked inside his jacket pocket, waiting to pull the pin. On the night of the gala, the ballroom glistened with chandeliers and polished floors. Waiters floated around with champagne flutes while live jazz played softly in the background. Lydia arrived on his arm, radiant, confident, the picture of a woman who believed her lies were untouchable. Richard was there too, his wife at his side, blissfully unaware. Mark's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was Victor. "All set. The emails are queued. Just say the word." Mark sipped his drink, scanning the room. Laughter, clinking glasses, speeches about integrity. He almost laughed himself at the hypocrisy of it all. As Lydia leaned in close, whispering something about the decor, Mark thought to himself, "This is it. The walls you built with deceit are about to collapse, Lydia, and I'll be right here smiling when they do." The stage was set. The world was about to learn the truth. The ballroom shimmered under the golden glow of chandeliers. Laughter bounced across the room, glasses clinked, and polished speeches filled the air with hollow words about loyalty, teamwork, and integrity. Mark sat quietly at a round table near the front, Lydia seated gracefully beside him. She looked stunning in her emerald dress, flashing smiles that could disarm anyone. But beneath that smile, Mark saw the deception he had uncovered, the same lips that whispered devotion to Richard while dismissing him as invisible. Richard sat a few tables away with his wife, Susan. He looked smug, confident, his hand occasionally brushing Lydia's under the cover of the white tablecloth. Mark noticed it. So did Victor, who stood in the shadows of the room as a hired waiter, camera phone ready. The company's CEO raised his glass. "Tonight we honor commitment. To our company, to each other, to the values we hold dear." The audience clapped, glasses rose, and Lydia leaned toward Mark with a faint smirk. That smirk was the last straw. Mark slipped his hand into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and sent one word to Victor. "Now." In less than 60 seconds, the room began to shift. Phones buzzed on tables, notifications dinged. Confusion spread like a ripple across the sea of suits and gowns. One executive frowned, scrolling through his phone. Another gasped, hand flying to his mouth. Susan, Richard's wife, went pale as her phone screen lit up with photos. Her husband locked in an embrace with Lydia, kissing her as if the world didn't exist. The noise of conversation began to collapse into murmurs, then into shocked silence. One by one, heads turned, first to Richard, then to Lydia. "What's happening?" Lydia whispered, her smile faltering as she glanced around. Mark didn't answer. He just sipped his champagne, eyes fixed on her. Susan stood up suddenly, her voice sharp enough to cut through the stunned air. "You lying, cheating coward!" She hurled her glass at Richard, the wine staining his crisp white shirt. The entire ballroom gasped. Cameras from phones were now out, recording the chaos. Richard stammered, trying to speak, but the executives around him had already started pulling out their own phones, showing each other the evidence. The CEO's face darkened, veins standing out in his neck as he read through the damning emails. Lydia's face drained of color. She looked at Mark with wide, panicked eyes, her lips parting to speak, but no words came out. Mark leaned close, his whisper steady, almost tender. "Smile, Lydia. Everyone's watching." The CEO slammed his fist on the table. "This is unacceptable, disgraceful. Thornton, Lydia, my office, now." The music had stopped. The gala had turned into a public execution. Lydia, once admired, was now the center of disgust. Richard, humiliated in front of his wife, his colleagues, his entire company, couldn't even lift his head. Mark sat back, calm, composed. He had just detonated the bomb, and the blast radius was spreading fast. This was only phase 1 of her downfall. The fallout from the gala was swift and merciless. What had started as a glittering night of celebration ended with whispers, stares, and reputations torn apart under the chandeliers. By the next morning, the story was everywhere within the company. Anonymous emails had found their way to inboxes across departments, and the evidence was impossible to ignore. Lydia sat at her desk, her hands trembling as she tried to type. But no amount of keystrokes could silence the storm brewing outside her office door. Colleagues who once greeted her with warmth now avoided eye contact. The HR director's secretary knocked on her door. "They want you in the boardroom. Now." She knew what that meant. Meanwhile, Richard Thornton wasn't spared either. His wife Susan had made sure of it. The moment she left the gala, she marched home, gathered every shred of financial document, and began contacting lawyers. By sunrise, divorce proceedings were already in motion. And she didn't plan to go quietly. Susan was determined to take half of his wealth, his reputation, and whatever was left of his dignity. The boardroom meeting was brutal. Lydia sat across from a panel of stern faces, her heart pounding as they presented the evidence. Emails, receipts, surveillance photos. The HR director didn't even bother with niceties. "You've violated company policy, professional ethics, and destroyed trust at the highest level," he said coldly. "Effective immediately, you are suspended pending a full investigation." Lydia tried to explain, her voice cracking, but every word she uttered sounded hollow against the weight of the proof. Richard, seated beside her, tried to salvage his career with a pitiful defense about personal mistakes and boundaries crossed. But the board wasn't interested. Both of them were escorted out of the building like criminals, their years of work reduced to a walk of shame through the lobby. That evening, Mark waited for Lydia at home. He cooked dinner. Steak, perfectly seared, her favorite. When she walked in, her mascara smudged, her eyes swollen from tears, she froze at the sight of him calmly setting the table. "You're home early," he said casually, pouring her a glass of wine. She sank into a chair, her shoulders shaking. "Mark, But he held up his hand. "No need, Lydia. I know everything." Her eyes widened. Yes," he cut in, his voice steady but sharp. "Every message, every hotel, every lie." He slid a folder across the table, the same one Victor had compiled. "You underestimated me." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "Please, Mark, I made a mistake. I wasn't thinking clearly." 8 months of an affair isn't a mistake," he interrupted. His eyes, once warm, were now stone. "It's a choice. And you made it over and over again." She broke down, begging, pleading, reaching across the table to touch his hand. But Mark didn't flinch. He let her cry, let her feel the weight of the life she had burned to ashes. This wasn't forgiveness, this was the prelude to her final undoing. Lydia spent the night on the couch, her sobs muffled by the cushions. Mark, meanwhile, lay in their bed staring at the ceiling, his mind as sharp and steady as a scalpel. The exposure had destroyed her career and reputation, but he wasn't finished. She had betrayed him, humiliated him, and tried to throw away their marriage like it was nothing. Now, he was going to take everything she valued most, piece by piece. By morning, his plan was in motion. He scheduled an appointment with a high-profile divorce attorney, a woman named Margaret Lawson. Known across Chicago as the Shark, Margaret had a reputation for tearing unfaithful spouses apart in courtrooms. Sitting across from her in a sleek office lined with legal books, Mark laid out the evidence. The photos, the texts, the hotel receipts, the HR emails. Margaret flipped through them with the cold precision of a surgeon. "You have her cornered," she said finally, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "With this much evidence, the court will have no sympathy for her. We'll push for infidelity as grounds for divorce. That means not only will you walk away free, but we'll also aim to strip her of financial benefits. Spousal support? Forget it. She'll be lucky to keep her clothes." Mark nodded, his expression unreadable. "I don't just want out, Margaret. I want her broken. She took my trust, my pride. I want her to feel the emptiness she created in me." "Then you came to the right person," Margaret replied, tapping the folder. "We'll file immediately." At home, Lydia tried everything. Apologies, promises, even desperate intimacy. She begged for another chance, clinging to the version of Mark she once knew. But he wasn't that man anymore. One evening, as she knelt before him, crying, Mark calmly placed the divorce papers on the coffee table. "This isn't a discussion," he said flatly. "It's happening." Her face crumpled. "Mark, please, we can fix this. Don't throw away 8 years. You already did." He cut her off. His tone was cold, final. "I'm just taking out the trash." When she realized he wouldn't budge, Lydia's tears shifted to rage. "You think you're punishing me? You'll regret this. You'll end up alone." Mark simply stood, collected his coat, and walked out. He didn't even look back. Days turned into weeks and the court battle unfolded exactly as Margaret predicted. Lydia entered the courtroom with a frazzled lawyer she could barely afford, her once polished appearance reduced to weary desperation. Mark, on the other hand, sat composed, supported by a powerhouse legal team and a mountain of evidence. The judge's ruling was brutal. The divorce was granted on the grounds of Lydia's adultery. Mark kept the house, the assets, and full financial security. Lydia was left with nothing but her tarnished name and the clothes she walked in with. The silence in the courtroom as the gavel struck was deafening. Mark had won. But he wasn't smiling. Revenge wasn't sweet. It was cold, bitter, and final. And Lydia's downfall still wasn't complete. Lydia left the courthouse that afternoon with her life in ruins. The cameras outside swarmed her like vultures, flashes exploding in her face as journalists shouted questions. "Lydia, do you have anything to say about the affair? Did your boss coerce you or was it consensual? Are you going to appeal the divorce ruling?" Her once confident stride faltered. She pulled her coat tighter, shielding her face, but the damage was already done. By evening, her name was trending online for all the wrong reasons. Headlines painted her as the ambitious executive who slept her way up the ladder and destroyed her own marriage in the process. Back at Richard's penthouse, she sought comfort, but found none. Richard, who once showered her with affection, now treated her like a liability. "Do you know what you've done to me?" he snapped one night as she tried to plead with him. "Because of you, the board is breathing down my neck. Investors are pulling out. I've worked 20 years to build this company and you've turned it into a scandal circus." Lydia flinched. "Richard, please, I need you. I lost everything." "Then maybe you should learn to live with nothing," he spat, grabbing his coat. "I'm done." He slammed the door behind him, leaving her in silence. Within a week, Richard cut all ties. He blocked her calls, canceled her access to his apartment, and reassigned her office. By the following Monday, she arrived at work only to find her security badge deactivated. Security escorted her out in front of stunned employees. Her so-called friends vanished too. The women she once dined with at upscale restaurants ignored her calls. The ones who used to envy her lifestyle now gossiped about her fall, whispering at social gatherings she was no longer invited to. Bills piled up. Without a job, alimony, or Richard's support, Lydia was forced to sell her designer handbags and jewelry just to cover rent. The luxury apartment she once flaunted on social media was replaced with a cramped studio in a forgotten corner of the city. Nights were the worst. She'd lie awake staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying every mistake. She remembered the moment Mark had helped her pack, the quiet fury in his eyes, the way he never once raised his voice yet managed to dismantle her life with precision. Sometimes she'd scroll through her old photos, smiling beside Mark at parties, holding his hand during vacations, posting captions about forever. The realization that she had traded all that for a fleeting thrill gnawed at her until her chest ached. One rainy evening, Lydia sat by her window, watching water streak down the glass. She whispered to herself, voice trembling, "I had everything, and I threw it away." Her phone buzzed. For a brief second, hope flared, but it wasn't Mark or Richard or even a friend. It was a bill reminder, red and merciless. The once proud woman who walked in heels through boardrooms was now a shadow of herself, hunched over in silence, broken, forgotten. And Mark? He didn't think about her anymore. His life moved forward, free from betrayal, while Lydia's world collapsed into ashes. The revenge was complete. Months passed. The city moved on from the scandal as it always did, chasing new headlines. But for Lydia, time stood still. Each day was a slow descent into obscurity. She wandered job interviews only to be politely dismissed once her name came up in background checks. Her reputation was a stain no employer wanted to touch. One afternoon, she sat in a coffee shop, scrolling through her phone with trembling fingers. She had typed a message to Mark 100 times before, and now she finally hit send. "Mark, I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I need you to know. I ruined myself. You were the best thing that ever happened to me, and I threw it away. I'm sorry." She waited. Minutes turned to hours. The three little dots of a response never appeared. The message was delivered, but unread. Mark had blocked her months ago. Meanwhile, Mark's life was quieter but lighter. The house that once echoed with tension was now filled with peace. He had redecorated, stripping away the old furniture Lydia picked, replacing it with his own choices, a symbolic purge of her presence. Every morning, he woke up without the weight of suspicion on his chest. Work had improved too. With his energy no longer drained by marital turmoil, his performance soared. Promotions came. Colleagues admired his composure, unaware of the storm he had weathered behind closed doors. But Mark wasn't rushing into anything new. Women approached him, curious and interested, but he wasn't ready. Instead, he poured his time into rediscovering himself, jogging by the lake, reading books he once abandoned, even reconnecting with old friends. For the first time in years, he was learning to live for himself, not for someone else. One weekend, while attending a charity gala through his company, Mark ran into an old acquaintance, Emily, a journalist he had known in college. She was warm, easy to talk to, and carried none of the duplicity that had poisoned his marriage. They spoke for hours, laughing like old friends rediscovering each other. He didn't feel the need to rush, but something inside him stirred, not the desperate need for validation Lydia once filled, but the cautious hope of genuine companionship. Far across town, Lydia sat in her dim apartment staring at a cracked mirror. Her reflection was almost unrecognizable. The glamorous woman who once turned heads at every event was gone, replaced by someone hollow, faded, forgotten. She whispered to herself, "If I could go back, I'd choose differently." But there was no going back. Choices once made are carved into reality. Mark had chosen silence, patience, and strategy, and in the end, his revenge was not only Lydia's destruction, but his own renewal. Life, cruel as it was, had given each of them what they had earned. And for Lydia, that meant nothing but ashes.